If you'd like to pick up any of the cards that you see in today's video, then I have to point you guys onto 3 Mana Inc., the best place in Canada to get your DBS and Digimon sealed and single products. Links will be down in the description. Hey everybody, it's Spear and back with another Dragon Ball Super card game video. This time specifically, we're going to start prepping for DBS Fest. So this isn't going to be the only video. There's going to be a number of videos where I discuss sideboarding and, you know, the best of one pre-sides and how that works, and then the overall meta of what we're going to expect going into DBS Fest. And this time specifically, we're going to talk about the sideboard options you should be considering going into the DBS Fest. Now, that's the thing, right? When you're going into somewhere, you know, a tournament where you're going to side, especially now that we're in best of one pre-sided world, you have to start considering, you know, what sideboard options do I take in that are appropriate for the meta. There's two ways to really think about sideboarding, and we're actually going to take that discussion into another video I'm going to post later this week. But just to kind of set the tone, you have to consider two things. One, what are my deck's biggest weaknesses? And two, what am I going to see throughout the entirety of the day? So it's kind of a toss-up between, you know, teching in for population size, but at the same time teching in for, you know, the worst things that your deck can deal with, which sometimes, depending on the deck you take, actually does not matter, because you could expect to see none of that. Sometimes you see some rogue decks come in and out of the meta specifically because they actually are in a really good spot, and the decks that hurt it a lot aren't actually around at the moment. We're not going to talk specifically about the meta as a whole in this video, but again, you can't sideboard without considering what the meta has. So specifically, when we're going to the DBS Fest, when we're accounting for the new ban list as well as best of one pre-sides, there's a specific set of leaders that we're expecting to be there based on previous power levels, and then based on the fact that they replace certain decks coming into the format. So to kick us off, yellow's still going to be incredibly good. So that's Trunks Vegeta is going to be an incredibly solid deck. It basically replaces Icarus. It doesn't play exactly the same, but it's kind of the same idea in terms of what you're trying to do, just best generic yellow stuff. Alternatively, you do have Goku Black as a strong wish leader option. Your hand is huge. You're a strong blue-yellow deck that can run some really great tech. You have a really powerful Aegis ability. So those are going to be the things you're going to be looking on that end. Again, to continue things that we've seen before, since Shenron is probably in a really, really good spot, Fu Shrouded not being in the format anymore means that it is the best turn 6 deck in the game. Every single turn, you're like essentially going +7, which is absolutely insane. So that's going to be an incredibly strong strategy going in that you have to keep in mind. Moving on to some new stuff, red in general is going to be incredibly powerful. The new U7 stuff is incredibly good, and you can play any variation of leaders. You know, like the big contender right now is the U7 Goku, but you can easily see the Gohan as well as the Vegeta take a spot because they play differently, but all with incredibly good tools to be able to get that mid-range stuff out. And again, red mid-range to red control is in a phenomenal spot now that Fu is no longer in the game. Then to bring it back to things that we're used to, Trunks is incredibly solid as well. You could expect Gogeta in some numbers, but Trunks is more consistent, and I do think the more consistent deck will turn out to be the stronger pick in a long tournament. And these are generally the leaders we're going to expect. Now, of course, there's rogue decks coming in and out. There's some archetypal decks that are half decent, like, you know, the King Colds of the world and all that. Red Broly Swap is actually like a half decent deck as well. So, and of course, there's Blue Soul Striker. So Soul Striker, blue, yellow. Expect to see that in good numbers, especially with the new God Unison. But it's really easy to hate out, right? But these are the decks you need to keep in mind when you're going into this meta, and you're gonna be like, okay, here are the things you're gonna have to sideboard into. So now that we have that little precursor, that understanding of what we're expected to see, now we can start establishing what sideboard decks you need to consider to be able to take on that meta. So there are generic options, and then there's a couple of options that I think are really well suited for this meta based on other colors, but it doesn't span every other color. So jumping into our first sideboard cards that are generic, any deck can start considering these. To kick us off, I'm going to start with Barrier Removal. So here I have Barrier of Hope as the example card, but every color has access to these. Some of them are even cheaper than 3 energy, but in general, Slug is going to be in a good number here. It didn't get touched on the ban list, and yellow is still arguably the best color in the game at the moment, even if it's been toned down a peg. So with that in mind, Barrier Removal, if your deck can't deal with Slug, some decks don't care, and that's fine. But if your deck is really leaning on hard drawing into cards, if you're playing Goku Black, for example, you're definitely going to need to consider it, because if they get out an early Slug and you weren't able to get all your Dragon Balls, you are deeply dampened by the deck's ability to shut you out. So that's one of the things you have to consider. Every color has access to Barrier Removal, so it's definitely a key card to start considering in your sideboard. Alternatively, Super Kamehameha, or just anything that prevents something from hitting board at cheap. Some of them, unfortunately, you do actually will have to pay once I've taken life because you're running a monocolor deck, but nevertheless, having a counterplay that prevents cards like Oceanus from coming in are deeply important. Red U7, an Oceanus is effectively a free turn. It's basically a hatch, and if you're going to play that strategy, you need to know that you're going to be able to tech in some cards that are able to shut that down so that you can keep extending yourself. Some people are going to lean hard on their floodgates, and you're just going to have to punish that by being able to go in. So Dark Kamehameha, Beer's Ball is another one, but again, if you're not a multicolor deck, you're not going to be able to take the life. But nevertheless, those are the things you're going to have to keep in mind, and they've done a great work. We've seen those cards do explicitly well at Worlds because some people were lean on them, and then you can just shut them down. Super Kamehameha is extremely good, and every other color should definitely start considering their own options to start shutting down floodgates to be able to press your aggro. Another card in the same vein is Chord Sky. Especially in Red U7, you're going to be milling it out anyways. So that's an example of a card you can run, but any deck can run them, right? If you're going to floodgate me, if you're going to play cards on my turn, well, then I'm going to make you warp cards. So it's an extremely good tech. It's much more affordable now, thanks to the Mythic Booster Box too, and should definitely be inclusion in, I'd argue, almost any sideboard at this point. Alternatively, Blue Soul Striker, remember, is going to be a huge deck in this meta. A lot of people are putting a lot of bets in the deck being incredibly good. I think it is. I think it's going to be very strong, especially with the God Unison, but it is hateable, very hateable. And there are two kind of blue hates, right? There's Chi-Chi's the example one I have here, where you're kind of preventing your opponent from restanding on counters. And then there's Borgos, where you can proactively prevent Soul Striker from being able to untap on their turn, as well with the God card. So these two silver bullets specifically for blue are going to be huge. So definitely consider them. I think almost every color, if not every color, I'm not too sure about black, has access to both, where it prevents the proactive as well as the defensive one. You definitely want to consider these. They're going to do a ton of work, especially if you're running yellow deck. Chi-Chi just runs really well with Slug and being able to completely shut down your opponent. So main decking is an option, but now because we're going into a best of one pre-side, you don't have to waste main deck slots in them, and you still get the utility of having them in your side if you end up at top cut and having the best of 3 option. So incredibly good tech, really good for your blue matchups. You definitely want to be considering them. Max Power Kamehameha is a card that, you know, depends on the deck. Some decks can very easily deal, like if you're green, I don't think you really care about Max Power Kamehameha because you have so many options in being able to deal with your opponent. But again, green's not really part of the meta. So, I mean, make of that what you will. But in general, red, you know, red has a really tough time dealing with big bodies. So if your deck struggles with that thing, as well as the fact that it doubles as a negate that you can get back turn after turn after turn, then it's definitely a strong contender there. I sideboard it in most of my decks because I like to play decks that don't deal really well with big bodies once they've hit the board. So it's a great option to consider on that front. Then we got Jiren. Blue is going to be played to some amount in this tournament, and of course A17 is going to be there. So if you're up against a blue deck that potentially could play A17, I know some people have been taking in SS4 as their blue leader of choice, and then that 100% leans on A17 as their strategy. So you're definitely going to want Jiren in there to be able to say, nope, I don't actually just lose to A17. So having that in your side is probably going to be deeply important, especially if you end up running into that matchup. It's always good just to have in your back pocket, and you don't need that many, right? This kind of card where, because A17's it's a 7 energy play, doesn't always happen on turn 7, but you know, let's say it's a turn 7 play by then, odds are you've probably drawn into a Jiren if you tech 2 into your sideboard. So it's just something to consider. Now, Cell Surge is gone, but that doesn't necessarily mean the hand control is gone completely. There are definitely green decks that can actually keep pushing it out. You know, some people love to lean on their, you know, the decks that mean the biggest of them, you know, like Starter Frieza. You know, shout outs to Lewis from the Hermitstyle Discord. I know he's a big fan of the deck. So, you know, you don't want to lose because your deck can't deal with hand control. Some decks can, like if you're playing Soul Striker, you're probably already playing 4 Draw Apes in your deck or some number of them. So I don't think you actually need this, especially since when you awaken, you draw 2 cards. But if you can't, then maybe bring in Deborah. You know, like keep a couple of slots of Deborah. You don't want to be the deck that loses to hand control. Be like, oh, it doesn't matter anymore because hand control is dead. Well, no, hand control can definitely still exist. Starter Broly is another deck that people have used in the past before. So you definitely still want the option to actually be able to defend yourself from those kind of edge case scenarios. Now, the last card I'm going to talk about in terms of like generic deck, like any deck should be considering all these options. And I'm not, okay guys, don't run every single one of these cards in your sideboard. Definitely see what your deck is better at or worse at dealing with and go from there. But Kami is going to be the last one. We've seen Kami do a lot of work in some side tournaments that have been played out in the last couple of months. And it honestly is really well poised, especially when we're talking about yellow decks where they just incidentally build such a wide board of random 3 drops, 2 drops, you know, just in general, a really well positioned card in terms of meta, especially since if your deck is, you know, suited for it, can actually just be a one-sided board wipe. So it is actually like, I've strongly been like, I've popped off seeing the card do the work that it has, and I've been considering it as a sideboard card ever since. I think it does an incredible amount of work. Now, it's not great forever. You know, there are some formats that Kami super dead, especially against the black decks that are just playing like 6 drops turbo the entire game. But otherwise, I think it's an incredibly solid card and should definitely be a consideration for yourself. Moving on to the colored options, I don't have that many. I didn't dig that deep into it. Like, this is kind of a generic board guide. Like, these are the things you should be considering, especially given the meta leaders that we've seen coming down the road. So on that front, there's a couple of colored options that are great sideboard. Some of of them I'd argue are even main deck. I know I have a couple of people who disagree with me on that front, but Broly Crown, for example, is a phenomenal sideboard card. It's kind of irrelevant almost whether it's a main board or sideboard card, because if you're going to play in a completely best of one pre-side tournament, who cares what's main board and sideboard, because you're always going to be sideboarding at the start of the game. But nevertheless, I think Broly Crown, if you're going up against a control deck that's slow, you can rip out the key parts of your opponent's deck. You can rip out floodgates before they're actually able to use them, and you get information. I think the biggest thing you get is just, you know what your opponent is doing, and you have near perfect information about how to deal against your opponent. So on that front, Broly Crown is really good. Blue Impulse is another card. It's a good card, but it's in green, right? So it's like, are you running a green deck? Hey, if you are, then you should definitely be considering Blue Impulse. A lot of decks right now are running cards that just come in. I mean, almost every deck at this point are playing cards that come in on your turn defensively. So just being able to Blue Impulse them and basically say like, well, that's a board wipe is really solid. It's really clutch, and definitely should be something that you consider. Alternatively, there's Big Amor also. You could. Again, it completely shuts down some decks. Some decks just auto-lose to this, so you should definitely be considering it as part of your decks. With that said, guys, those are, you know, the most generic overall cards that I'd say I'd recommend for your sideboard. And these are the kinds of ways you're supposed to be thinking about sideboarding when you're going into this meta, especially DBS Fest. These are the prospect things. There's definitely gonna be surprises. I think everyone's always open to being shocked, and I'm open to being shocked as well. And I'm sure I've missed some key cards as well. So if there's some key cards that you guys think should be in this sideboard guide of sorts, then definitely let me know in the comments down below, guys. You know, if anything, not only are you helping me learn, but you're also helping anyone in the community who might have missed out on some sideboard tech. But again, don't take these 15-ish cards and just throw them in your sideboard. Definitely take into account what the biggest needs of your deck are and what you're expected to face, and then suit your sideboard accordingly. But if you want a place to get started, all the cards I talked about today are fantastic places to get onto. Oh, I missed one. Well, we're just gonna throw it on here. Broken Seal. If your opponent's playing a combo deck and you know they're about to play their secret rare the next turn or something ridiculous like that, you can just Broken Seal and you effectively buy yourself another turn. It's incredibly powerful for that. Definitely keep that in mind. And Oceanus Negate, I think I missed that as well. Against some decks, it's just free, especially since Red U7 is going to be a big deck in the format. You're basically just buying a free turn. So keep those in mind as well. With that said, guys, if you like the video, give it a thumbs up. Hey, if you dislike it, thumbs down works too. If you want to watch more videos this week, we're going to dedicate the whole week to talking about Best of One Pre-Side, talking about DBS Fest, and getting you ready for that tournament. Subscribe buttons in the corner. With that said, I'll catch you guys on the next one. Ciao.